The darkness of night had enveloped the small town of New River, Virginia, in a thick shroud of silence. The sky above, a canvas painted predominantly black, seemed to stretch endlessly without a hint of starlight or moon glow. It was August 1960, and the residents were already settling into the oppressive quiet when strange occurrences began. The town had always been known for its isolated location surrounded by dense forests and swamps. The local legend spoke of an ancient curse, attributed to a malevolent spirit that haunted the waters near their river. However, no one could remember such tales being as frequent or severe as they were now. One evening, after dinner was served in Mrs. Margaret Collins' modest home, she decided to take her young son William out for a stroll by the river. The boy, only 7 years old, looked up at his mother with wide eyes and whispered, "I don't want to go," but Margaret simply smiled and said it was okay. As they walked along the muddy bank, Margaret noticed an unsettling movement in the shadows of the willow trees bordering their path. She turned, her heart pounding against her chest, as if seeking any form of reassurance she might find from the forest. But there was nothing to be seen beyond the flickering fireflies dancing through the leaves. But suddenly, a dark figure emerged from within the dense bushes, its shadowy contours looming ominously in the night air. Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine as that dark presence approached them, a feeling of dread creeping up her back like an unwanted guest. The boy cried out, his voice a frightened wail as if seeking safety in someone's arms, and Margaret's heart constricted painfully within her chest. Her hands instinctively went to William's shoulder as she tried to shield him from what she now knew was danger. But it wasn't enough, for the shadowy figure was already upon them. It was a moment too swift, a blur of motion that left little trace except for the sharp pain in Margaret's throat and the cold metallic taste on her lips. She could hear William screaming, but her mind refused to fully process his cries until the very last second when she felt something solid hit her chest, a forceful jolt that sent shivers up her spine before everything went dark. This was only the beginning. Margaret Collins was pronounced dead at home shortly after midnight, her body cold and lifeless as she lay on the bed surrounded by a pool of crimson that spread like ink across her sheets. The medical examiner confirmed Margaret had died from blunt force trauma to the chest, but there were no signs of struggle or any other injuries indicating how she could have been hit so forcefully. The autopsy results did little to explain away the horrifying scene, and it only served to deepen the mystery surrounding the incident. What was worse was that William Collins couldn't recall seeing anyone approaching them by the river. He had described a dark figure lurking, but not one he recognized or could connect with any known local legends. William's story became more confusing when his classmates began reporting sightings of what they called the monster. Reports surfaced detailing shadowy creatures moving through their schoolyard at night, often seen lurking near drainage ditches and under bridges. Some children claimed to have heard eerie screams echoing from the woods, a chilling reminder that something was indeed amassing its strength in their midst. Dr. James Harris of the local hospital received more disturbing reports. He documented several cases where patients experienced unexplained hallucinations and vivid dreams featuring monstrous apparitions similar to those seen by both children and adults. The phenomenon seemed to be growing with each passing day, but there were no known scientific explanations for this surge in paranormal activity. The police department began investigating the case, assembling a team of investigators including Detective Sarah Thompson and Dr. Harris himself. Their findings did little to assuage their own doubts or clear up any loose ends. There was nothing concrete linking the multiple incidents, fingerprints on clothing found near the river didn't match anyone in town, and DNA evidence seemed contradictory at best. A peculiar discovery made during the autopsy of Margaret Collins threw a wrench into everything they knew about her death. A small piece of fabric embedded in her lung tissue bore an unfamiliar pattern that appeared to be from some other material. It was sent for analysis, but results had yet to come back as of now. The investigators started to notice inconsistencies across all cases. The shadowy figure at the river and near the schoolyard weren't described by witnesses with similar physical attributes or movements. They seemed more like abstract entities rather than a tangible entity capable of causing such injuries. What investigators discovered next would shake even the most skeptical minds, unveiling a tale darker and far beyond their comprehension. But they were still searching for answers, driven not just by scientific curiosity but by the desperate need to comprehend what could have happened in New River that night. The mystery deepened with each new discovery, casting an ever-widening shadow over this isolated Virginia town. As the investigation progressed, a cryptic note discovered in Margaret Collins' handwriting began to unravel more of the puzzle. The note read, "Watch the dark waters. They know our secrets." Detective Sarah Thompson and Dr. Harris were deeply disturbed by this message. It was written on the day before her death, but there was no indication that she had shared it with anyone or intended for someone else to find it. Their attention then turned to Margaret's personal belongings. In a drawer of her dresser, they found a small envelope labeled, "The Book." Inside were photographs and documents detailing the history and legends of the New River area. The photos showed strange creatures lurking in the water, and the documents were filled with warnings about the dark forces that dwelled beneath its surface. One particularly disturbing photograph was taken from the old bridge near where Margaret had been found. It depicted what appeared to be a monstrous figure standing on the bridge's parapet, its eyes glowing ominously in the dim light of the setting sun. The body language and posture were unmistakable, it held a sinister air that matched the description provided by witnesses. The documents also included an old prophecy written by a local elder named Father O'Connor. He warned about the coming of the malignant man of waters, a malevolent spirit said to possess the river's power, driven to destruction and torment by its unending cycle of violence and betrayal. The prophecy spoke of a time when humanity would face its deepest fears and darkest secrets. As they delved deeper into Margaret's journal entries from years prior, the investigators found a pattern emerging. She kept detailed notes on her visits to an isolated shack at the far end of the river, where she had been searching for a way to communicate with the spirits. The journal entries described eerie visions, strange noises, and cryptic messages that seemed to hint at something sinister waiting in the shadows. One particularly chilling entry spoke about seeing the eyes of many watching from beyond, and how their presence was becoming more insistent and palpable every day. It became clear that Margaret had not only become a victim but also a participant in this supernatural phenomenon, her life intertwined with whatever malevolent force threatened their town. By now, the investigation team found themselves surrounded by an atmosphere of dread, as though they were stepping into a web spun from ancient evil. They continued to sift through evidence, each discovery leaving them more unsettled and driven deeper into the heart of this mystery. And then they found something that no one was prepared for. Hidden behind Margaret's shelving in her bedroom closet was a small, leather-bound journal containing entries and sketches detailing the rituals she had performed to commune with the dark forces beneath the river. Among the drawings were symbols from various pagan religions, depicting figures holding sickles and dripping blood, accompanied by spells invoking malevolent spirits. The revelations uncovered during this crucial moment would have sent shivers down even the bravest of investigators' spines. What they found was not just a sinister human presence but an entwined web of dark magic and ancient rituals, all orchestrated with chilling precision to summon and feed on unsuspecting victims like Margaret Collins. With each new piece of evidence, the investigation team realized that their understanding of the malignant man of waters case had barely scratched the surface. The darkness lurking in New River was far more complex, intricate, and malevolent than they could have ever imagined. And as they continued to unravel this twisted tale, a sense of dread settled over them like a thick fog, making it increasingly difficult to shake off the feeling that something ancient and terrible was still waiting for its moment to strike again. The official investigation report dismissed Margaret Collins' writings and rituals as a series of psychological delusions or hallucinations driven by her troubled mind and desperate attempts to understand what had befallen her. They attributed the photographs of strange creatures to misidentification, citing local folklore about misunderstood wildlife anomalies. The journal entries were treated with skepticism, labeled as nothing more than a woman's paranoia in an era where such things seemed all too common. The experts concluded that Margaret's death was likely caused by a combination of mental illness and physical exhaustion, exacerbated by environmental factors typical of the time, such as unregulated industrial practices and limited access to medical care. They suggested that her final days were characterized by extreme isolation and fear, leading to a breakdown from which she never recovered. The town council approved the official explanation with swift efficiency, eager to move forward with plans for new infrastructure projects without further delay or public unrest. The media coverage was minimal, overshadowed by other local events deemed more pressing. Margaret's life ended as quickly as it began, and her story faded into obscurity among the multitude of forgotten tales in their town. But the truth, as it turned out, was far worse than any theory. The official explanation failed to account for the most disturbing evidence, the ritual journal kept in secret by Margaret, which detailed elaborate spells invoking malevolent entities. The photographs taken at the shack were not just misidentifications, they captured glimpses of entities more ancient and powerful than anything imagined before. As the months turned into years, whispers began to spread among select individuals who had somehow stumbled upon these documents. They spoke in hushed tones about a deeper, more sinister force at work, something far older and more malevolent than any single person or ritual could explain. The darker theory that investigators whispered about involved a centuries-old pact between human practitioners and the entities beneath New River's surface. Margaret was merely one of many unwitting participants who unwittingly facilitated this ancient contract, unaware of its full ramifications until it had taken hold of her life like a vice. The town council's approval masked a web of corruption hidden within their ranks, corruption that benefited from keeping the truth buried. For decades, they had been covering up evidence and protecting those whose actions aligned with the pact, ensuring that any revelations threatened the very foundation upon which this small town was built. The lives lost, the rituals performed, were all part of a far-reaching conspiracy known only to a select few. As the years passed, other townsfolk began to realize they had been complicit in perpetuating this dark cycle, their own actions unwittingly feeding the evil lurking beneath. And yet, until Margaret's final revelations came to light, no one could fully grasp the true horror of what lay hidden beneath New River's surface. But the truth, as it turned out, was far worse than any theory. The official explanation had failed to account for the depth and scope of this ancient evil, and their cover-up only served to amplify its power. The townspeople found themselves in a nightmare where every step they took seemed to deepen their complicity in something monstrous and unfathomable. As the investigation team delved deeper, their findings began to unravel a layer upon layer of deception and corruption that had laid beneath the town for generations. They discovered documents detailing extensive sacrifices made by previous townspeople at New River's depths, documents signed with blood and oaths binding them to this unholy pact. The investigators found artifacts embedded with runes, suggesting intricate rituals were used not just for invoking malevolent forces but also for maintaining a balance of power. These artifacts had been hidden in old warehouses and forgotten corners, carefully guarded from prying eyes by those who held sway over the town's affairs. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The discovery of these artifacts revealed that Margaret Collins wasn't an anomaly at all. She was part of a larger network, a spiderweb of connections across generations, each generation falling into service and maintaining this ancient contract. The journal entries were indeed twisted truths, spun to cover the sins of their predecessors and protect them from judgment. But as they continued to uncover these secrets, one disturbing detail emerged that changed everything. Margaret had not been the first victim. There was another woman whose story had similarly faded into obscurity, another person who had witnessed horrific acts but lived on in silence due to fear or complicity. This second woman's fate had been sealed by those very rituals and oaths binding her family. The investigators' initial conclusions were like a veil lifted from a world they could no longer ignore. Margaret Collins wasn't just another troubled mind, she was the tip of an iceberg, the first casualty in a long line of sacrifices to this malevolent entity. Her ritual journal, with its detailed spells and incantations, had been merely one more tool in a far-reaching conspiracy that had laid dormant for decades. The horror intensified as they realized the scale of what Margaret Collins had discovered was just the tip of an iceberg, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and deception. The town council's approval of their findings wasn't about truth but protecting themselves from exposure. They had been complicit in maintaining this dark legacy, each generation playing a part in sustaining the pact. The weight of these revelations sank deeply into their minds, turning every moment of silence they had shared with Margaret into an act of complicity. The townspeople stood before them, not as simple victims or perpetrators but as participants in a ritual that had held sway for generations. Each person who had kept this dark secret was now seen as both participant and accomplice to the horrors perpetuated by their predecessors. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The realization hit them like a cold shock: their own lives were interwoven with this ancient evil, not just victims but also unwitting participants. Every sacrifice made in fear or desperation had fed into this darkness, each generation's actions fueling its growth and strength. As they struggled to grasp these new truths, the investigators found themselves caught in a web of their own making, a labyrinth where every step led deeper into the heart of an evil that had been hidden for too long. The horror was not just about Margaret Collins or even this town but how deeply intertwined it had become with each individual's actions and beliefs. In the end, what no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The realization brought a shiver down their spine: the evil they uncovered wasn't merely from outside forces but also internal. Each person in that town had unknowingly played a role, contributing to this darkness by keeping secrets and maintaining the balance of power. The horror didn't lie solely with what was hidden, it lay within each individual's actions and complicity. The investigators realized too late that they were part of the problem, involved in a cycle where every step forward only deepened their involvement. The horror intensified as they faced the realization: even after uncovering the truth, they could never fully escape this dark legacy. Every person who had kept silent or acted in fear was now connected to this malevolent force. In that moment of dread and revelation, they knew that escaping the grip of this evil would be impossible. The horror wasn't just about Margaret Collins or this town but a collective guilt bound by generations. Each person's role, no matter how small, contributed to this dark legacy, making them part of an unseen web of complicity. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The realization brought a final shiver down their spine: they were trapped in a cycle where truth only deepened their complicity. The horror wasn't just about Margaret Collins or this town but a collective guilt bound by generations. Each person's role, no matter how small, contributed to this dark legacy, making them part of an unseen web of complicity. In that moment, the investigators understood they could no longer escape the shadow cast by their own actions and those who had come before them. The horror was not just about Margaret Collins or this town but a collective guilt bound by generations. Each person's role, no matter how small, contributed to this dark legacy, making them part of an unseen web of complicity. The realization hit like a final punch, driving home the depth of their involvement in something far greater than they could comprehend. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. Their own actions and those of their predecessors formed the very foundation of this malevolent entity, a cycle that would continue as long as individuals remained complicit or unaware. In that moment, the investigators understood: the horror wasn't just about Margaret Collins or this town but a collective guilt bound by generations. Each person's role, no matter how small, contributed to this dark legacy, making them part of an unseen web of complicity. The realization hit like a final punch, driving home the depth of their involvement in something far greater than they could comprehend. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. Their own actions and those of their predecessors formed the very foundation of this malevolent entity, a cycle that would continue as long as individuals remained complicit or unaware. They stood there, forever changed by what they had discovered, knowing too late that escape from this horror wasn't possible. The legacy of Margaret Collins was just one chapter in a larger story, each person's actions and silence contributing to the very darkness that consumed them. In that moment, their understanding brought only dread, the knowledge that they were all complicit in something far darker than any truth could illuminate. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The realization hit like a final punch, driving home the depth of their involvement in something far greater than they could comprehend. Their own actions and those of their predecessors formed the very foundation of this malevolent entity, a cycle that would continue as long as individuals remained complicit or unaware. As they finally pieced together the last fragments of this tragic tale, their hands trembled as they read the final documents, each one more confirmation of what they had already suspected but couldn't quite believe. Margaret Collins' story was just a whisper in an endless symphony of fear and sacrifice. The investigators knew now that each person who had ever lived in this town held a part of this dark legacy within them, their actions either deliberate or accidental contributing to the horror perpetuated across generations. The revelation brought them no comfort, instead, it filled them with an even deeper sense of dread at their own complicity. They realized too late that they were not just witnesses but active participants in this malevolent entity's creation. Margaret Collins' sacrifice had served as a beacon, a single point of light illuminating the darkness, until now. The realization hit like a final blow, sinking deeply into their souls. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The question that still haunted them and would forever linger: what had kept this evil in check for so long? This town had become a testing ground, a playground where forces from beyond could play out their darkest desires. Margaret Collins' ritual journal had been merely the spark igniting an ancient inferno fueled by countless sacrifices over generations. And while they had uncovered the truth and exposed the corrupt practices that had maintained this balance of power, they couldn't shake the nagging thought: what other forces were waiting to be unleashed? They knew now that there was no escaping their role in this dark conspiracy. Margaret Collins' sacrifice hadn't just been about one individual's fate but a call to action for others who would come after her. The horror wasn't merely a past event but an ongoing threat, lurking beneath the surface of each generation. In the end, what no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The answer seemed as elusive as Margaret Collins' final victim, still unseen and unknown. What had kept this evil in check for so long? The question lingered like a specter over their discovery, haunting them with the knowledge that they could never fully comprehend or solve. As they stepped back from the scene, each investigator carried within themselves not just the weight of what they had uncovered but also the realization that this darkness continued to exist. Margaret Collins' sacrifice hadn't been in vain, it was merely a small act among countless others who had lived and died under its shadow. The final thought haunted them: was there someone out there, waiting to be exposed or drawn into this ancient balance? What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The question that still lingered with them: what had kept this evil in check for so long? As they walked away from the town and its haunting legacy, their hearts heavy with what they knew, they couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Collins' sacrifice hadn't been enough. There was someone out there who would eventually come into their light, a force waiting to be exposed or drawn into this ancient balance of power. In a single moment, their lives were forever changed by this revelation, transformed from observers to participants in something far greater and darker than they could ever comprehend. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The question that still haunted them, unanswered and unsolved: what had kept this evil in check for so long? As they walked away, their hearts heavy with what they knew, a final thought lingered like a specter over them: someone out there who would eventually come into their light. The darkness continued to loom, waiting for its next victim. In that moment of silence and reflection, the investigators knew, Margaret Collins' sacrifice hadn't been enough. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all. The question that still haunted them, unanswered and unsolved: what had kept this evil in check for so long? As they walked away, their hearts heavy with what they knew, a final thought lingered like a specter over them: someone out there who would eventually come into their light. The darkness continued to loom, waiting for its next victim. In that moment of silence and reflection, the investigators knew, Margaret Collins' sacrifice hadn't been enough. What no one realized until much later was the most chilling part of all.